Welcome to the Center for Global Enterprises Expert Connect program, a series of one-hour live discussions with thought leaders touching on the key topics that business leaders are concerned about. And one of the most compelling issues facing global business leaders is the importance of building trust with governments. Why? As our guests will point out, no global enterprise operates in a government-free zone. What's important to remember is governments have the power to create, eliminate, or change markets overnight if they choose to do so. Or look at it from a market perspective. Taken collectively, governments collect about $17 trillion in revenue and employ over 100 million people. And its commercial assets constitute the largest pool of wealth in the world. Government is a market like no other. Let me introduce our guest. David Beier is venture capitalist and managing director of Bay City Capital. He's held senior management positions with Amgen and Genentech and served in the White House as chief domestic policy advisor to Vice President Al Gore during the Clinton administration. Dean Krehmeyer is executive director of the Darden School's Institute for Business and Society at the University of Virginia. He also serves as the executive director of the Business Roundtable Institute for Corporate Ethics. And I'm Ira Sager, vice president of learning initiatives for CGE and moderator of the Expert Connect series. Before we get started with our discussion, a few housekeeping notes. We would love to have you send us your questions, your comments live during this session, and you can do that on the NovoEd platform that we use and you're viewing this broadcast from. Right below, you'll see a comment box, so just type in any questions you have, and we will get to them in the course of this discussion. In addition, you can follow along through some slides that David and Dean have provided, and you'll see a link, Building Government Trust, that allow you to download those slides. If you like, we also have a Twitter feed that you can send us notes and comments, questions, and that is #GSExpertConnect. All right, so let's get started. Why is government trust so important?
Let me take that question first. Government, as you suggested, Ira, is a large player as a market force by itself. Traditionally, governments performed a regulatory function, and they perform a procurement or market setting function. They buy goods and services. But increasingly, they're standard setters or regulators in the economy well beyond the traditional health and safety components or financial services. And I think we've seen many new companies, even small companies, being dramatically affected by government. And so it's incumbent upon CEOs and senior managers of companies of all sizes and configurations to focus on this issue, both as an offensive measure to create an advantage for their company and a thoughtful defensive way of how do you deal with government.
I'll add to that. Another important reason is as the world and the environment in which businesses operate becomes more complex, becomes more global, increasingly governments are representative of the communities and the societies that they represent. In some respects, the astute CEOs, the astute leaders are able to look at government actions and potential actions and see through them to see how they reflect the communities in which businesses operate, the stakeholders in which businesses engage. So governments are really important to understand those interests because it contributes to the ability of businesses to achieve their mission, create value, and really deliver results.
Let's talk a little bit about the role of the CEO and bringing up, I think, some news reports today. Lloyd Blankenfein was quoted in the papers talking about Federal Reserve interest rates, Donald Trump's candidacy, but he was very critical of the Chinese government and their handling of the recent stock market crisis. Talk about the role of the CEO in establishing that trust and the relationship with governments around the world.
It's a great question, Ira. Let me take a step back first and describe a little bit, at least how the Center for Global Enterprise conceives of the idea of the firm. The firm, in general terms, is either a family-owned business, a state-owned enterprise, a privately held company, or a publicly traded company. of sufficient size and intention to become active on a global platform. So having said that, in some cases, there'll be smaller enterprises that are dominated by a small group of people. In the case of a publicly traded company, it could be a large apparatus that has many factors and features. The key ingredient, and Dean and I will talk about this a little bit more in the conversation, is what are the values that inform the company? By values, I mean, what are they trying to accomplish other than return to their shareholders some financial rewards? So the values of transparency, respect for consumers, listening to local communities, those values need to inform the public face of the company. That is, the reputation that it has in the society at large and towards government in general. And I think, as we'll try and illustrate during the course of the conversation, having a long-term view of a relationship with the government is key. So in the case that you're talking about, the head of Goldman Sachs talking about the Chinese government, it's important to keep in mind that this is an episode in a long-term relationship that will go on for years and decades. And so partial criticism of a complex fact pattern may not be the optimal approach to building government trust. I think from my point of view and experience, it would be better to have some of those conversations in private, and to the extent that they're in public, to do so in a more constructive way.
Do companies, from your position, do enough to, when they create their government affairs department and they approach governments, are they leaning on or using their corporate statements, their vision enough to inform their relationship?
Well, I think that the key ingredient in the reputation sense, and Dean and I have written about this, is, do you have a commitment to ethical behavior? And in addition to the commitment, do you have the competence to execute it? So I read a book recently by Eric Schmidt of Google, and he pointed out the value statements of Enron. They seemed really good.
Right.
But they had no competence to perform them. So I think it's a linkage between intention and competence. I know, Dean?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. It's there's numerous examples. You cited one of the words, the placards, the signs on the wall of the values are, one would read and identify them as world-class. The intentions, how you execute on those, and to put it even more concretely, how that drives not just behavior of the CEO, but behavior throughout the organization. That's the real key. That's what differentiates the words from the actual activities and what a company stands for. And those are the values that are important in all functions of the organization, certainly including government affairs.
Yeah, I think another way to think about this, Ira, and I know we have some students who are going to be watching this program. So if you're early in your career and a government official approaches you and suggests an unethical or illegal activity, how do you respond? Hopefully you're working for an enterprise who values ethical commitments to doing the right thing when no one's watching. And it's very difficult for large enterprises to inculcate the culture down to working level as to what to do exactly in every circumstance. One large multinational company I'm familiar with had a playbook that was 400 pages long. Well, obviously no one read 400 pages. They decided it was better to have 4 pages and general guidance. And key to that was, when in doubt, say no, buy time, seek senior management or next level management guidance. That simple commitment to ethical behavior can inform an entire company and is the key to maintaining a strong reputation.
Let's talk a little bit about the different roles of government, because I think people need to appreciate that they are the largest, in some cases, the largest buyer of goods, and also enforce the laws of the land. How do companies need to go about understanding and playing with, or not playing with, but understanding and leveraging the different roles of government?
A key part is understanding the dimensions you talked about. The industry I previously worked in, the pharmaceutical industry, highly regulated. Everything that gets onto the market has to be approved by government. So leave aside those kinds of government activities. We spent a lot of time focusing on government as a revenue collector. What was tax policy? Because that could drive corporate behavior. What was the attitude towards foreign governments by the US government in trade policy or in regulatory matters? So we spent time lobbying and seeking to influence the Commerce Department, the State Department, the Trade Representative's Office. Equally, we spent time in Brussels talking to the European Commission about a wide variety of issues that were unique to Europe. So understanding the points of contact, friction, and opportunity. The one component that I would stress above all others is most companies think government is the enemy and needs to be controlled, as opposed to seeing it as a market opportunity where if you do it correctly, your business can be advantaged because they understand what you're trying to do to improve jobs, to add products that consumers want, to expand trade, or to do other things that are relevant to the national goal of the government you're dealing with. That failure of vision is a pretty common flaw in how companies think about government.
Right, it's been an antagonistic relationship. So what you're saying is that the trust with government can be a competitive advantage in the marketplace. Can you cite some examples of companies that have really turned that relationship into an advantage in the market?
Sure. From my personal experience, I mentioned that I'd spent a bunch of time in Europe talking to members of the European Commission staff about how to regulate a particular kind of pharmaceutical product. And we did it on the basis of we're going to be completely transparent, we're going to be science-based, we're going to put patients first, and we're not going to focus on revenue maximization. That approach worked very effectively, and the rules that the Europeans developed on this particular topic ended up reflecting pretty accurately that orientation, and that was a competitive advantage because we thought we as a company could perform up to standards that were science-oriented, as opposed to trying to erect anti-competitive barriers, which might be appealing in the short term, but in the long term will fall.
Let me sort of articulate as well some themes. There's numerous examples, but one of the interesting things that we look at in business schools as we think about how do we apply some of these lessons for students is some themes to your question. And the themes that repeatedly sort of make themselves visible are first, that the examples, the best practice, they're values driven. They start with, as David articulated, the values of the organization in engaging with governments. Secondly is they're part of building and establishing relationships, not one-off transactions. There's a relationship that continues. Both governments and organizations are intended to be long-term organizations. They engage in relationships around that. And third is they have as a foundational element a set of stakeholder relationships and understanding of who the stakeholders of both the organization and the engaging government are. And they think about how are the actions or the decisions that I'm promoting, that I'm engaging in as an organization, how are they adding value to those stakeholders, whether it be customers, whether it be the communities in which organizations operate, and certainly one of them is in my investors as well, my financiers. But how is this adding value to those stakeholders? And those are sort of some important themes when you hear various examples of what went well in these types of examples.
Well, another way to think about this, Ira, is if you looked at government affairs as a tactical, one transaction at a time activity, you would think about the lobbying tactics as, oh, we should mobilize our suppliers or our investors or our employees. And frankly, you can hire firms who do that kind of work.
Right.
That's transactional. It may be necessary in a particular public policy dispute, but it's much better if it's actually authentic and that it's long-term and, as Dean suggested, based on common values. So if you're a large global enterprise and you want to be genuinely committed to the country that you're in, having a program that encourages small and medium-sized enterprises to be vendors, and you have a long-term relationship that's based on trust, respect, fair business practices, transparency, fairness, all those kinds of things, that community can be a source of immense strength in building trust with government. If you view them only as transactional partners that you call on when you need it in a crisis, that's not a very good business plan. It creates friction around business issues, but it also deprives you of any kind of sense of authenticity when dealing with government.
Has the Center for Working with Governments shifted? And by that I mean, for example, companies would typically say, okay, I have to have a large presence in Washington, D.C. These days, obviously, you see in the papers, Brussels has emerged as another area that is drawing a lot of attention by companies. But how should companies think about how they approach the different governments in the different markets?
Well, I think the theme of the Center for Global Enterprise is to think about this as a global question where you frankly don't know the home country of the global enterprise, don't know the nationality of the CEO, and you don't know what markets they're seeking to enter. So I would hope that we would get away from a Washington-centric world and a world that's focused too much on the West, that is just Europe and the United States. So I would start with a recognition that a strong relationship with the home country, wherever the home country is, headquarters country, is important. Second, the key markets, that is markets where a company either currently obtains or is likely to obtain the dominant share of revenue. And third, I would recommend a disproportionate focus on the markets that are the riskiest, because those markets actually pose the greatest reputational risks to the global enterprise. So yes, it might be that country X is only 2% of revenue, but they may pose risks on rule of law or corruption issues that require more expenditure, even though the market is small. I think we've seen in the headlines over the last few years the reputational damage of compliance problems for major multinationals who did not pay attention to the risky markets and did not apply the sufficient resources.
And it's not just reputation is a factor, not just for large multinationals, global enterprises, it's for the emerging startups that we see. And we'll get back to that discussion in a few minutes. I want to go to one of the questions that was submitted by David Eng, who asks, on wicked problems with societal complexity, he must be from Boston, such as climate change, income inequality, what can global enterprises do that governments cannot? And what can governments do that global enterprises cannot?
It's a great question. We could spend an entire hour just on that question. My sense is that there are some things where private enterprise can do an effective job with greater nimbleness and clarity than government. Setting standards, for example, in the early days of the internet. I was chairman of the Electronic Commerce Working Group, and as government, we tried to push as many of the decisions about internet governance out of the government because we thought it was an emerging technology and that a command control regulatory state approach would be wrong. So there are some instances where standard setting belongs in the private sector, and if done correctly, can protect consumers, advance the public interest, secure economic growth. But that requires each company to get beyond their own short-term quarterly earnings focus. On the other hand, there are some issues where government has the only imprimatur or stamp of approval from society to make a bigger judgment. So obviously government has to provide the structure for tax? What are the rules of trade with other countries? What are the immigration laws? So there are some things that are inexorably governmental, and the private sector can seek to influence them appropriately, but can't effectively set those rules.
Yeah, that is a terrific question, and the example issues mentioned are certainly among the what one would call sort of the mega issues facing both of these enterprises: the enterprise that is government, the enterprise that is business, all of us as society. There's a lot of emerging examples of each enterprise playing to strengths, and David articulated several of those. And what you increasingly see when things go well is the ability to play the strengths, the ability for businesses, for example, to play to that nimbleness and be able to contribute the core competencies that have been developed in the course of them fulfilling their mission and delivering their products and services. And even to some extent in addressing some of these issues, the entrepreneurial or innovative spirit that pervades in organizations, and the mentality of being able to take on a portfolio of activities, recognizing that while many of them will be successful, some of them might be less successful, but what do we learn from those as an organization? That is built into the DNA of a lot of organizations, and it's where a lot of innovation in addressing these issues in partnership with governments can occur.
I want to talk a little bit about trust. It's a very broad term and can mean a lot to different people. How do you define it? But I guess more important for our viewers, what are the best practices for building trust and some of the tools that they can use to really build trust with governments?
That's a good question, Ira. The synonyms for trust, or the other words that you could use, are strong, structured, sustainable relationship. Trust is a little bit more on the value side. But if you think of it in the following way, if you're talking with somebody in your personal life, whether you're inclined to do something to help them is in part based on who you are as a person, but also how do you feel about the other person? Do you trust what they're telling you? Are you motivated to want to be helpful? Whether or not you like them. Like may not be the only operative word in dealing with government. A test of government trust is, will a government official pick up the phone or send an email to somebody to seek neutral, accurate information about a policy decision that they're about to make? Do you become a resource that is sufficiently trusted that you become part of the conversation because you can put yourself in the position of the government official from the outside as a corporate official? You can argue the other side, that is your opponents, and it could be 3 or 4 different stakeholders and different interests, provide accurate information, provide access to experts, and recognize that at the end of the day, the government officials as surrogates for society, as Dean talked about, are going to be making the decision, and your role is to offer assistance, not to dictate a particular outcome. So building trust facilitates that role as trusted advisor.
Are there tools or best practices that you advise when companies start to really focus on building trust?
A couple. My judgment, it does start at the top.
Mm-hmm.
So if it's a small disruptive enterprise, like let's say Uber 5 years ago, the CEO has to be in charge.
5 years ago?
It's actually 6 now. But you need to have a commitment by the CEO to the values and the competence that we talked about before, in understanding of the market of policy making, both the risks and the opportunities. And they need to create a structure that's organic to their organization. How big, how deep, how many functions, reporting relationship.
Right.
It's not the CEO's job to be government affairs person in chief. but it is their job to be oftentimes the face of the company in key markets, home country market, key markets from a revenue point of view. Second, in addition to the organizational component, is commitment to the long term. It's a really dumb idea to have a single meeting with a government official and expect a positive result. So there's the tactical questions of make sure you talk to the staff before you talk to the minister, follow up with the staff, talk to the staff all the time, but it means also repeated visits to the key decision makers, whether they're ministers, cabinet members, legislators. Go back and put contributions in the goodwill bank by offering assistance on things that aren't burning platforms. Don't ever show up the first time when the house is on fire. And those two components, organizational component and a commitment to the long term, are the two suggestions on best practices that I would focus on. But Dean, you may have others.
No, I think let me sort of reinforce. I'll sort of provide a little foundation to that. We actually did some research on trying to get a better understanding of what some of the levers of trust are. Oftentimes, as you know, we see various trust barometers, I call them, where the question is asked, how much do you trust, whether it's an enterprise or an organization? And the answer varies somewhere 0 to 100. Unfortunately, it's usually closer to the low end than the higher end. But the question for leaders is, so what do I do with that? What am I supposed to do with that? So we actually did some research, and we sort of conducted a lot of surveys of individuals, and we put them in various stakeholder roles. So we put them in the role of either customers or employees or investors or community members, and sort of asked, what are the levers when we say trust? What does that mean? What sort of moves the dial? And we looked at a number of different factors, everything from the academic words or ability, which is basically, do you do what you say you're going to do? Benevolence, academic word for do they like you? By far, the number one factor that drove trust was integrity. And it sounds simple, but it's really revealing in terms of what we've talked about in terms of the values have to be there. Yes, there's a process for the meetings or the engagement, the term of it, the long term. Yes, there's a process for that, and that's very important. But it's got to be built on the foundation of those values, and certainly integrity we found to be one of the values that is a driver in that. And that's got to be evident not just in your organization, but how you engage, when you engage, who you engage with.
And that pays dividends, not just in relations with governments, it's with customers, suppliers,
absolutely,
employees. So.
One other way of building on what Dean's talking about is, how do you engage with people in your sector? That is, if you're in financial services and your senior management, your CEO, takes a position that speaks to hearing customer concerns about automatic teller machines fees, or transparency of interest rates, whatever the issue is. If your leader is an industry spokesperson who appears to get it, that can pay dividends in terms of credibility in dealing with government. It requires that you get outside of the insular quarterly earnings inside the company mentality and plan the traffic of becoming a spokesperson for a larger set of values beyond just the shareholder interest and short-termism.
I want to go to another question that was submitted and on the topic of trust from Peter Evans. This is a long question, so excuse me for reading. The idea of building government trust implies certain conditions. It seems to imply that 1, governments are trustworthy, and so it is worth investment on the part of companies, and 2, that governments can sustain levels of trust once it has been established. Google's recent experience in Europe shows that agreements may not hold. In 2014, Google made a deal with EU's competition chief. However, when that person left office, Google found that the agreement collapsed and it faced even more criticism and a risk of very costly regulations. In the case of Venezuela, some foreign companies found that building trust was futile and left in 2007. The question is, are there some cases where trust framework falls down? When should companies not even try? If initially established, how do companies know that trust will be reciprocated over time?
Well, unpacking that question, Ira, may take a really long time because there are multiple questions.
Absolutely.
And so I'm going to rephrase the question.
Go right ahead.
How do you deal with corrupt governments, governments that may not be as trustworthy as you would like?
Mm-hmm.
And how do you deal with inconsistent government decision making? Let me take the second one first because I think it's more common problem. The inconsistency of government action is table stakes. That's going to happen. You have to develop a relatively thick skin and make sure that your positions are relatively consistent over time and based on some principled understanding of whatever the policy issue is. The fact that a new political party has taken power or a new minister has taken a role means, frankly, you may have to start over again. You may have to refine your arguments, but hopefully your arguments are going to be consistent and you just have to keep at it. So I don't want to comment about the specifics of Google. With respect to the second question about what do you do with governments who are less rule of law oriented? That's a harder question. At a certain level, you have to decide, are the reputational risks worth the revenue that you're going to obtain? And if you've made the decision to be in the market, then you just have to be aware of the limitations of your ability to influence government if their compliance record or rule of law orientation is suspect. In the case of Argentina, risks of expropriation go back to the 1950s. Many multinational companies, particularly in the oil and gas sector, face this issue all of the time. And most of the time, they've chosen to make accommodations to the local government because they think the larger social good is access to energy. And occasionally they'll withdraw from a market because that equation of revenue versus compliance is out of kilter in such a fundamental way. The harder thing is governments that are in between, where there is a risk of rule of law problems or corruption problems that makes it difficult to do business, but tolerable. And I think that goes back to the conversation Dean and I started before, which is if as a company you're committed to integrity, transparency, fair dealing, and those values are part of your corporate culture, you probably are sacrificing or risking some revenue or revenue gain on the basis of compliance with those values. But in, I think, our view, in the long run, you'll be better off because you will not experience the reputational damage from non-compliance, and your employee base will effectively believe in what you do and be more committed to the goals of the enterprise.
This is, I was going to say another add-on to that is this could also be an example David referred to earlier of when companies have leadership positions in their industries. And so this engaging in some of the areas where the rule of law might be a little bit less robust is there could be opportunities where companies go in together. They go in as an industry, not in any colluding way, but in a way that says the strength of us collectively could promote a more equitable operating framework. You can sort of define that along the various metrics to say this now shifts the risk. It makes it less risky for us to do it. So you can set some rules and frameworks for operating and then let the market play out as it is. But it's one where could be opportunities to not go in solo, but to go in with cooperative competitors.
You mentioned reputation in this conversation. what role does reputation or company brand play in establishing relations with different governments? Do you come in and create your reputation in the local market? Do you obviously bring a reputation along with you? And how do you manage that reputation and ensure that it's good and remains solid?
Well, it obviously starts with product or service that you're providing to society. And those products or services tend to have their own reputation. And it actually begs an interesting question on organizational matters. How does senior management deal with the combination of sales and marketing, branding, communications, investor relations, government affairs? Those functions all have knock-on effects with respect to each other. And one of the organizing principles that we, I think, are suggesting in this conversation, and based also on some research at the Darden School, University of Virginia Business School, is the CEO needs to have, or the senior management team needs to have, visibility around those multiple functions so that they're all rowing in the same direction. That if it's about customer service and the customer is going to get a phone call response, you dial, and that within 60 seconds you're going to get somebody on the other end of the line, that commitment to consumers is something that will precede any government interaction by that company. So if there's a disconnect between the claim of the CEO, we're from XYZ company, we're in this country, we want to help you, but the customer service is terrible,
right.
The dissonance between those two will be so jarring that unlikely government officials are going to trust that government.
And with social media, there's no place
company
to hide these days.
Yes, there's no place to hide.
And increasingly so.
Right.
It's interesting. We did some other research that sort of looked at the impact of social media largely. And traditionally, the stakeholder group who one would see paying the closest attention to what a company does is what you would call the investor group, primarily because that's where a lot of the communications were and the regulatory filings, et cetera. So investors were typically the group that you would see paying closest attention to what companies do, followed by customers. With social media, we've done some studies and we looked at this globally, and it's sort of true globally too, is increasingly investors are not becoming the top group that are looking at it. Increasingly what you're seeing are customers are paying very close attention, and what we would classify as community members, general members of the community. And they're receiving their information, obviously, in all of the various mechanisms of social media. Different argument in terms of the validity of that, the quality of that. But point being is that people are paying very close attention to the actions of companies, and not just from an investor perspective, but from all aspects. And that's really important as companies think about the impact on their reputation, not just in their home country, but in particular as they're expanding globally.
So an example, Ira, if you're in a sector where you want to prove that you're innovative, that is, that you've got new products, that you're spending money on research and development, and therefore you're adding to the social benefit of society, if that's your claim, you'd better have a constant flow of information using multitude of channels of communication, whether it's news releases, press conferences, advertisements, etc. And that reputation has to be nurtured over time in order to be credible. You can see some global companies, General Electric, IBM, seek to do that through a variety of mechanisms. They have corporate philanthropy, corporate social responsibility, traditional sales and marketing activities. And then they have communications from their leadership that try and reinforce we have a better idea and we're executing against this desire for new products and new ideas, so that there's a sense of dynamism about the company, which permits a continuous conversation with government about what's happening inside the company, as opposed to we're here on this transaction and we want this tax break or we want this customs ruling. We want a conversation with the government minister about the opportunities that this particular company is going to offer that local society over a period of time, and people can have a common vision, company, government, around something that's meaningful.
I want to talk a little bit about Uber specifically, and I guess the emerging new business models, platform companies in general. And I want to read a quote from the Financial Times story on Uber yesterday and hear your thoughts on this. Uber's aggressive style has failed to bulldoze opposition in Europe as it has so effectively in the US, perhaps even paved the way for harsher treatment than it would have received if it had played by the rules. Let's talk a little bit about Uber and your perception of the company as seems to be in the news from not just the relations with Europe, but also in the US in terms of California and employment law. How are they approaching their government affairs relations, and what do younger companies, emerging business models, need to focus on as they grow and expand their operations?
First, I confess I'm an Uber user.
And who isn't?
and I like their services. So,
yeah.
And I don't want them to go away. I think the Uber case study can be too Uber-centric. So let me take a step back and try and talk about the disruptive business model first, and then address your specifics on Uber. The idea of doing something and seeking forgiveness as opposed to permission,
Right.
which is the fundamental nature of disruptive activities, is a common theme, whether it's Airbnb or a whole series of other activities. You could even include Bitcoins, I suppose. If you take a step back and you deal with the fundamentals of what those business models are seeking to do, who is going to benefit from this new good or service? And what is owed to society or customers in general, whether it's consumer protection or honest, fair dealings, et cetera? If the company is committed to those fundamental values, their tactics can become a little more flexible. But you have to have a commitment to doing that, to protecting people in a certain way. Otherwise, it's going to seem very transactional and very commercial in its orientation. So to deal with Uber specifically, they've done some things extremely well. So I'm going to start with the praise. In the United States, they work very effectively with the group Mothers Against Drunk Driving to establish the principle that it's far better for somebody to hit an app on their cell phone and call for an Uber driver than to drive home drunk. And they prove that that's a service that's going to help the public. They've also done a very good job in some cities, some of the time, providing data to transportation policymakers about traffic patterns or safety-related issues. So those kinds of things are a contribution to the reputation of Uber. On the flip side, if the rush to become a first mover becomes the dominant theme of the conversation, it doesn't seem to me to be completely about customer service and customer empowerment. Rather, it seems a more competitive game vis-a-vis Lyft or their Chinese competitors. And so in some cases, the question is how to establish industry standards. And I'm going to go back to that. If you think of this disruptive activity, what are the commitments that Uber is making to its consumers? We're going to show up on time. We're going to be convenient. We're going to be safe. We're going to scrutinize our drivers and hold them accountable and not provide bad drivers or bad experiences or dangerous experiences. The last one is what's caused most of the problems or alleged problems in foreign markets, whether it was in India. And I'm not dealing with the facts. I'm not taking a view of whether there was or wasn't a problem. But if you lead with customer safety, customer service, then the conversation about the nature of regulation can change, and they have a stronger platform. Using just the tactic of empowering their consumers to complain about excessive regulation has been very clever, very effective. And if I were there, I would be doing that. But in the long run, they have to get back to the bedrock values they're trying to inculcate.
But doesn't that undermine the long-term relationship with government?
I think it's very early for some of these disruptive companies. Use Airbnb as an example. I think in some cities, they've agreed to pay hotel taxes.
Right.
They've dramatically increased their insurance coverage so that the people who are providing the properties, apartments or houses, have better reason to be protected against damage by customers. Their interaction, where there's an evaluation, and this is also true for Uber, the customer of the driver of the customer, is a paradigm shifting business practice, which does facilitate transparency and can improve customer service. So I think there are many things that they've already done that are quite thoughtful and innovative. The question is, how do they proceed to draw this through in multiple markets at the same time? That, my judgment, probably requires greater centralized value articulation and probably a different management style than merely letting country managers go off on their own and cut their own deals or create their own problems.
Uber may or may not know it, but they've got thousands and thousands of consultants known as business school students analyzing this every day. And it's a really interesting question because one of the things that's occurring is we're seeing a shift in, it's called the sharing economy, but one way to look at it is it's a little shift in the stakeholder map of how organizations operate in this particular area. When it comes to drivers, employees, independent contractors. When it comes to government, as we've talked about, understanding when they say government, what role are they really thinking of government in those various instances? And so it's interesting. I think what we're seeing with Uber, Airbnb, and the like is the emergence and quite frankly, you see the real difficulty and challenge that a very sharp company with very sharp people, a great group of investors and supporters, a very loyal customer base, all those things look like they're assets, and they are. And there's still the complexity that comes with how do you think about your stakeholders and how do you consistently apply the thinking and the process steps of how, as a company, am I adding value to that group? How am I working with that group? How am I establishing relationships? And I think that's why you see in some cities things go really well. In others, there's glitches along the way. It's part of a fast growth, a new shift in the economy that they happen to be working in. And like I said, it continues to present some interesting challenges that many business school faculty are very happy about because it provides a lot of conversation in classrooms.
Ira, if I could take the conversation in a little different direction off the same thing, which is in talking to CEOs, for example, earlier this year in India, the focus was called Uber, but really what it was is every sector being fearful of disruption. Whether it was outsourcing back office computer services versus the cloud. There is a palpable sense in the larger business community, and I think one that's important for the students who are watching this to pay attention to. How do you remain innovative and how do you avoid becoming stuck in an outdated business model?
Right.
And that's a real challenge as a business matter, but it's also a great case study, as Dean is talking about, for how students can think about what would they do to innovate in a particular sector. So if you're thinking about delivering commodities to grocery stores, I have a young friend who's in charge of the automation of a warehouse. And there are machines from Germany being used in York, Pennsylvania. And how does that help deliver value to grocery store customers? Well, it also eliminates jobs. So there's a social component to that. And so there is, I think, a reason to be anxious about the disruption of virtually every business, the disaggregation, or whatever word you want to use. How you deal with that? Are you going to be the horse and buggy industry trying to prevent the onslaught of the auto industry? Or are you the auto industry trying to set standards for safety?
Right. Well, it's also an issue that governments are grappling with, obviously. And, they have entrenched, established businesses, jobs to protect, as well as fueling innovation in these new growth areas, and that they're balancing as well. But are you seeing from your experience, we see established companies who really do a wonderful job of helping governments understand and fulfilling that role of providing unbiased information. But are you seeing enough attention paid or activity among some of these newer business models, these disruptive businesses, in helping government officials understand the role of innovation and their services?
I've seen some really quite remarkable and thoughtful outreach. I'll shout out for Google and their drone program. I know nothing about the specifics of what they plan to do, but I do know that whenever they talk about it, they talk about the Federal Aviation Administration with respect. They've engaged in a deep policy, science, engineering conversation about the benefits and the risks of that technology. And they want to work as a partner with a regulator about that industry before there are problems. That kind of respectful conversation can be a much more effective way than insulting the government official by saying, we're geniuses here in Silicon Valley and you don't know what you're doing. Now, there may be some truth to the fact that the government officials don't know the latest details of drone capabilities or engineering standards, but the disrupting sector has an obligation to help the government understand and then take principled positions that have long-term status based on honesty, fair dealing, all of those kinds of things. Because if you don't, and you just seek to obtain competitive advantage, you can succeed in the short term, but either a competitor will call you on it, or the consumer base will become activated and disenfranchised with your approach.
I want to go to another question from our audience, and this is from Ogichi Adela, and she asks, how can multinational companies or corporations build trust with government in developing countries?
I think it starts with respect. Understanding the local market, understanding the goals and aspirations of the people in the countries, understanding the authenticity of their aspirations. If you don't start from that position and you start with this as a transactional matter where their market is the same as everybody else's market, I think the phrase that comes to mind is plan globally, act locally. The acting locally has to be real and has to be a product of active listening. That is respectful understanding of the differences between that market and the market that you previously went into, and not creating false analogies or seeking to apply a lesson from another developing country to the second, third, or fourth. Each country deserves and merits its own unique approach. And if you go about it that way, then I think you'll have a better chance for a positive long-term relationship.
Yeah, I would add, I think and you see numerous examples of it, particularly in developing and emerging economies, of a company has to understand why they're going into that country, why they're going into that economy, and not just from their perspective, but from this perspective of the government, and therefore through the government, the community in which they're going in. the product or service they're going to offer, how is it going to raise the standing of that community? How is it going to contribute value? If they're going to put in a manufacturing facility, what's it going to do for the employment base and wages in that community? How is it going to benefit that? So thinking through, I think, not just the perspective of the shoes one is standing in, but also standing in the shoes of, if I were that government and I had the constituents they had, what would be the concerns, desires, wishes I would have? And how does my corporate purpose, my reason for being, contribute to that? And I think having that dual perspective is one that we've seen all kinds of examples. There's the common examples of new drugs and pharmaceuticals that come into communities, ways to increase food production, all those things that hit on big societal issues. And yet there's numerous examples too of some of the smaller things too, but they're still adding value.
So to give an example of what Dean's talking about, I'm familiar with a global enterprise who sources materials for their stores, and their procurement process has standards. And those standards can either be sensitive or insensitive to environmental concerns. So if you're in a developing economy where there may not be the regulatory apparatus or the government capability, financial or otherwise, to have a environmental regime that works all the time, well, that could disadvantage the people of that country. If this large retailer sets standards that say, we want to create as sustainable an environment as possible, and we'll give preference in our procurement processes to vendors who provide sustainable containers, let's say, for packaged goods, that will change the small and medium-sized enterprises who are providing to the large retailer. And net, it's actually an environmental statement by the company. And that can be done in cooperation with the government, but it stems from an understanding of what the people of that developing country want and need, and working with the government as a collaborator to come up with business programs where you can do good and do well at the same time.
We have a few minutes left. I want to go to one more question from David Eng, who asks more of a structural. He wonders if the multinational organizations, as opposed to the globally integrated enterprise that we at CGE write and talk about so often, are better positioned to build trust with governments on a country-by-country basis.
No.
Well, we have a little more time than that.
I think the reason is a conceptual one. And when Sam Palmisano wrote his now seminal article in Foreign Affairs in, I think, 2009, he talked about the rationale for a global enterprise. That is something that has a set of fundamental values that respects the global market. And it's more than the sum of a series of individual countries constituting a multinational enterprise. And I think we see building government trust as an example of things like competent global finance, human resources or talent management, supply chain, sales and marketing activities. If you don't start with the aspiration of being global, what you will tend to go towards is either decentralization model where country managers are kings or queens, or a command control from the center of a multinational, but that doesn't understand the nature of the local markets. So you get a cookie cutter approach, or you get a confederation of businesses. A global enterprise is one that's truly integrated based on values, aspirations, that, again, plans globally, but acts locally.
Did you want to add anything?
No,
to that?
I think what's the key among many elements is a global enterprise, again, as David said, has those values that represent the the broad markets in which they operate. And I think that becomes a unifying element of how the organization sees itself, how it sees its mission, its noble purpose, and how it goes about achieving those in the effective and nimble ways it does. So I would concur.
Well, I want to thank our guests,
Thank you.
David Beier, Dean Krehmeyer.
Thank you.
And I want to remind our viewers that you can download and review this session at our website, on our NovoEd platform, and on our YouTube channel, and continue the conversation. Send us more questions. Dean and David don't know this, but we're going to ask them to pop in and respond to questions you have in the future. So again, either on the NovoEd platform that you're on right now, or our Twitter feed, which is #GS Expert Connect. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.